Today we're going to be going over several of the basic built-in data types in Python. In the last video, we went over lists, which is a commonly used data type in Python, in which we can store multiple data values in a single variable. Additionally, we also went over how to index into a list, in which you can access a certain position into that list and make use of it. So now that we went over lists in the last video, in this video we're going to be going over several of the basic built-in data types, in which I'll be going over 4 of them. So the first built-in data type that I'll be going over is int. And int, as you may recall from the last videos, and it is an integer, which represents numeric values. So now that int is familiar, as it is basically just numbers like 1, 2, 3, and so on, the next data type I'll be going over is called a float. And float is also a numeric data type, built-in data type in Python, in which is basically an int, except that it also allows for decimal values and fractional values. So in order to see how this works, we're going to prompt the user to type in 2 numbers, and we're going to print out the sum of those 2 numbers, making use of int and float both to see how it works. So we're going to prompt the user to type in a number, and we're going to declare a variable n and set that equal to int input. And recall from the last few videos, we need int outside the input so that the user types in the integer. So we have first number, and now we're going to have another variable in which you're going to be saying the same thing. So int input, and then the second number. Colon. And after we prompt the user to type in 2 numbers, we're going to print out the sum of those 2 numbers. And how to do this, we just simply need to do n plus I, which is these 2 variables up here. So whatever the user types in this one is going to store that in this variable, and whatever the user types in this variable, in this, is going to store in this variable. And after we have these 2 variables, we're going to print out the sum of those 2 variables. So n plus I, which means these 2 variables. So now we're going to try to run it, and we're going to type out 7, 8. It's going to print out the sum of these 2 numbers, so 15. And now if we try to type out 15 and 19, it's going to print out the sum of these 2 numbers, 34. And after we try to type out -3 and 7, it's going to print out the sum of these 2 numbers. So now if we try to print out a decimal number, we're going to try to type out 8.9. It's going to give us an error message saying invalid literal for int with base 10. And what this means is that int basically only allows for numbers like 1, 2, 3, not decimal numbers or fractional values. Now recall, the second data type I mentioned was float. And float is basically int, except that it also allows for decimal numbers and also fractional numbers. So to fix this problem, instead of int, we're going to have float, so that whatever the user types, it can also support a decimal and a fractional number. So we're going to replace float with int in these 2 variables. And now we're going to try to run it. So we can try to type out 6.7. It seemed to work. And we're going to print out the second number. It's going to print out the sum of these 2 numbers. And it's going to be in decimal form, since we have float in both of these, which basically means decimal numbers and floating numbers, as well as integers. And now if we try to rerun it and type 9.8, 4.5, it's going to print out the sum of these 2 numbers. And now if we try to print out 7, which also works here, it's going to print out 15.0, and it's going to have this additional 0.0 at the end, since we have more space for decimal places as well as fractional numbers in this known data type, built-in data type in Python, also known as float. So now that we went over int and float, the next data type I'll be going over in Python is called a string. And a string basically means an ordered sequences of characters or letters. And simply put, it's basically words. So what we've been doing in the last few videos, we have been printing out words like hello world, and that basically represents a string, since we're printing out words. And that's basically what a string is. It's basically words or a combination of words, which is composed of, in which we have ordered sequences of characters or letters that make up a word. So we have print hello world, which we did in the first video. This is a string because we have a combination of words, and those words are basically an ordered sequences of characters or letters like H, E, L, which make up the word. So now if we try to print out, it's going to print out hello world. So now that we know what a string is, we're going to be going on to into more depth on how concatenating strings. And recall, what concatenating string means is that we're joining strings together. But in this case, we're going to try to make a program and try to concatenate strings to an int. And let's see how it works. So we're going to first prompt the user to type in an int. So we have n equals int input. So we're going to try to prompt the user to type in input, which means number. And we're going to try to join the strings to the int. So recall how to concatenate strings is we have print and quotation marks, and the string we want to have within these quotation marks. So we have the number is, and then recall how to concatenate strings is we have plus variable. So we have this string here in quotation marks, and we also have plus n. But when you try to run it, we type in our number, it's going to give us an error message saying can only concatenate str, not integer. So what this means is that we can only concatenate strings to strings, which means you can only join strings to strings and not join strings with int. And we have this integer variable, and we're trying to join the string with int, which is why this doesn't work. So a way to solve this problem is we're going to be doing something called a format string. And what format string basically means is that we can basically solve these problems, like trying to join in strings with int. And how this works is that we're going to have print normally, and outside these quotation marks, the main addition is we're going to have f outside these quotation marks. Int. And we're going to be basically having an f, which represents a format string. And we have an f outside of these quotation marks. And instead of having the plus n, we're going to have the number is n, but we're going to keep this n in curly braces. So how this works is that we're first prompting the user to type in an integer, and we're going to try to print out a format string in which we can join strings with the int. So we have f outside of these quotation marks, and we're going to print out the number is n, which is this integer variable. And you need to make sure to surround this variable with curly braces, which means that when it's going to print it out, it's going to substitute this value of n into printing out this string. Now if we try to run it, the number is 6. So if we try to type out 19, then it's going to print out the number is 19. So this is a way that we can solve in which we can concatenate strings to integers. So now that we went over what a string is and going into more detail of how we can concatenate strings to ints, the last data type I'll be going over is a Boolean. And a Boolean is basically, it can only consist of two values, which is either true or false. So we're going to be making a program in which you can prompt the user to type in a number and check is that if that number is equal to 5, in this case, we're going to print out true. Otherwise, if it's not equal to 5, then it's going to print out false in order to see how Boolean works. So we have first prompt the user to type in info. So we have n equals int, which is how we keep doing this. So we have int outside the info so that the user types in an int. So we have int input, the number. And after we prompt the user to type in that number, we're going to check, is that equal to 5? And it's going to print out true. And recall, we need to use a condition for this. And how conditions work in Python, recall, is that we have if, and then the statement here. So checking if, then whatever the number the user types is going to store in this variable, and we're going to compare this variable with 5. So we have n equals 5, and we need a double equation sign, and that's basically how we can compare two numeric values in Python. We have one equation sign, which means whatever is on the right side is going to assign it to this variable. So in this case, we're comparing two values. It's going to compare this value with this value, and if they're equal, then it's going to print out true. And otherwise, if n is not equal to 5, and how inequality sign works is that we have exclamation mark equals, which represents inequality sign. So it's saying if n is not equal to 5, then it's going to print out false. So we have false here. And now if we run it, and if you type out 5, it's going to say true. And now if we try to type out 10, it's going to say not true, which means false. And if you try to type out 15, it's going to print out false. So this is basically how Boolean works. It only has two values, which are either true or false, simply put. And now we can simplify this code actually. Instead of elif, I can just say else. So how this works is that we have a checking. Recall, we have three types of conditions in Python. We have if, elif, which means else if. We have else. So if is just checking for a condition, checking if that is true, and it's going to run a certain command. Otherwise, if that's not true, then it's going to be going to the next statement, which means elif. So elif is going to basically check the next condition. If this condition is not true, it's going to check this condition if it's true, and it's going to run a certain command. And else basically represents the last condition, which means not if or else, which means it's going to print out the only remaining result that's left. And now we have if n equals 5, which whatever the user types, if it's 5, it's going to print out true. Otherwise, if it's not 5, then you can just simply print out false. Since we don't need L if n is not equal to 5, since the only other possible value is a number that is not 5. So if we try to run it and we type out 5, it's going to print out true. And if we type out 10, it's going to print out false. Since this is not true, so it's anyways going to print out false, whatever other value that the user types. So if you try to type out 1000, it's going to print out false. So now that we went over Boolean and how it works, and essentially all of the built-in data types in Python, in the next video we're going to be going over how to interact with characters or letters in a string. And we're going to be going over into more details of how strings work in Python.